Welcome back to Monitors Unboxed. Today we're checking out the Acer Nitro XV275K P3, a new 4K mini LED monitor that promises true HDR for gaming. This display is part of a new wave of lower cost HDR monitors using LCD panels, finally ditching crappy edge-lit panels for hardware with actual full array local dimming. For LCDs to continue being relevant in a market with increasing numbers of high-end OLED options, lower cost proper HDR displays are the only way forward. This particular Acer monitor has a highly memorable product name, the XV275K P3, not to be confused with the XV275U P3, which is actually a 1440p VA-based monitor. The XV275K P3, on the other hand, uses a 27-inch 4K 160Hz IPS LCD with a 576-zone FALD backlight, bringing proper hardware HDR support. Acer are also claiming at least 1000 nits of peak brightness, along with certifications like FreeSync Premium Pro and Display HDR 1000. All of this is available for as low as $550 US. That's the cheapest I've seen this monitor so far, down from its MSRP of $800. That's cheaper than the unimpressive Cooler Master GP27U I reviewed last year, and ultimately just $100 or so more than basic SDR-only 4K gaming monitors with otherwise similar specs. Is it worth spending that extra cash to get something with true HDR and local dimming? Let's find out. After taking the monitor out of the box, I was immediately surprised to see it actually looks different from the product page. The stand on Acer's website and some retailers shows a small square base with this multi-finish rear panel and red central highlight. However, the actual model looks quite different on the rear and has a three-legged stand base instead. Thankfully, some retailers such as Best Buy and Newegg have the right images, so not sure what's going on there. As a lower cost monitor with these specs, the XV275K P3 doesn't have the best build quality or use of materials. Most of the upper display section is made from a relatively cheap basic black plastic, and only the stand legs are metal. It's a functional design, but lacks any sort of wow factor you might get from a higher tier product. I was a little surprised to see on the rear that there's a curved RGB LED lighting element that looks quite nice, because the plastic around it is quite plain, but hey, gotta have RGB these days. The stand supports height, tilt, swivel, and pivot adjustment with an excellent range of height that will be suited to pretty much any setup. The swivel function is a little easy to trigger, which could be annoying if you occasionally bump the display. The stand legs are also a bit larger than typical for a 27-inch monitor, so it might occupy more desk space than some other solutions. However, the legs themselves are elevated a bit, so you can still fit in stuff underneath. Acer has included excellent connectivity, including one DisplayPort 1.4 with DSC, two HDMI 2.1 ports with full 48 gigabits per second bandwidth, and one USB-C port supporting DP Alt mode and 90 watts of power delivery. It also has a 2-port USB hub and an audio jack, although unfortunately no KVM switch functionality, a little disappointing considering all the USB ports and video inputs. I was very unimpressed with the OSD for two reasons. Firstly, it does not use a directional toggle, instead opting for stiff, hard to navigate face buttons along the bottom right edge. Secondly, the OSD interface itself is very slow, taking ages to adjust sliders like brightness as one example. A difficult to operate and navigate OSD feels quite dated, and while the feature set is fine, it includes a range of color controls and gamer features like crosshairs, anything that you want to activate for a specific usage scenario feels like a chore because of this design. The XV275K P3 is another monitor from Acer where if you want to use Adaptive Sync, you will not be able to change overdrive settings. As I recommend pretty much anyone game with Adaptive Sync enabled, this means there's only one set of results that are relevant in terms of response time performance, so let's take a look. The good news is that the performance in the variable refresh mode at 160Hz is actually decent. Enabling 160Hz also requires you to change a setting in the OSD, although it's not labeled as overclocking, so I'm not sure why it doesn't allow 160Hz operation by default. In any case, we do see use of overdrive in the Adaptive Sync mode with a good response time result of 6.5 milliseconds, little overshoot, and cumulative deviation below 500. This is typical IPS LCD performance. I was also pleased to discover few issues when testing other refresh rates inside the refresh range. Gaming at 120Hz or 100Hz still delivers around a 6ms experience with no obvious artifacts, and even when we push all the way down to 60Hz, there is only a small increase to overshoot, which isn't hugely noticeable in typical gaming scenarios. This means that the impact of not being able to change overdrive settings is pretty minimal, and a majority of gamers will be getting a pretty good experience. This monitor has a single overdrive mode experience, not just because you're forced into using the one mode, but also because this type of performance doesn't really justify changes or adjustments whether you're gaming at 160Hz or 60Hz, which is pretty great to see. However, I still believe that having overdrive settings available even in a VRR state is the best choice. I test monitors in a 21-degree room, but much warmer or much colder ambient conditions will affect performance, and that's where having the ability to tune overdrive can come in handy. Also, it's possible that we could have extracted slightly better results from fully user-tunable settings. Overall though, I don't think it's a big drawback to this product, and motion performance is good. Compared to other monitors, the XV275K P3 performs well, although it isn't a standout at its maximum 160Hz refresh rate. Tuning is pretty similar to the Gigabyte M27U and quite a bit better than the old Predator X27 from the early days of HDR gaming monitors. It's around 1 millisecond slower than products like the Sony InZone M9 or LG 27GR93U, which has a small to negligible effect. It's also not as fast as the Cooler Master GP27U, which is a primary competitor to this product. Performance across the refresh rate range is once again reasonable without being a standout. Overall response times are similar to other 4K gaming monitors like the Gigabyte M27U and LG 27GR93U, while the GP27U is about half a millisecond faster. Most of the monitors in the 5 to 6 millisecond range perform quite similarly on average, so let's take a look at cumulative deviation to see where the overall balance lies. The Acer monitor, despite not offering user-adjustable overdrive in the adaptive sync mode, is actually tuned quite well up against other products. The choice to minimize overshoot works well, giving it similar performance in this metric to other 4K IPS gaming displays. The GP27U is only marginally better by a negligible amount, and the same goes for other products in that 500 to 540 range. There could be some specific refresh rates where one monitor is better than the other, but as for a typical gaming experience, the XV275K P3 is just that, typical. Most of the displays listed here also perform quite similarly. For 120Hz gaming, the P3 is slower by a negligible amount. At 60Hz, again, there's really not much to talk about. The GP27U is slightly better tuned, but overall, the experience is close enough, and if you do plan on doing a lot of gaming at 60Hz, the performance on offer here is quite good. Like with the motion performance section, input latency is pretty typical from this display. A 0.6 millisecond processing delay at 160Hz when local dimming is disabled is pretty decent and in line with other monitors. This display doesn't have the highest refresh rate, so it's not going to deliver a lightning fast experience like some 240Hz or higher products on the market today, but it's perfectly sufficient for gaming. Power consumption, mid-tier. The backlight used here is not especially efficient, meaning that some non-mini LED monitors with similar specs do consume noticeably less power, such as the MSI 274 UPF at 25 watts compared to 44 watts for this Acer. But relative to other full-array local dimming 4K monitors, it's typical. It's similar to the GP27U. Like most modern gaming monitors, the XV275K P3 is a wide gamut display, supporting a very decent 98% coverage of DCI-P3 in addition to 99% coverage of Adobe RGB. This means the display is quite well suited to wide gamut productivity work in addition to HDR, as you've got plenty of reds and plenty of greens to cover both the main wide gamut color spaces. Rec 2020 coverage is also very high at 88%, one of the highest I've seen. There's definitely no shortage of saturation and color here. By default, this monitor ships with local dimming enabled in the SDR mode, and that causes some accuracy issues. Grayscale delta E's are elevated and parts of the presentation are too dark, seen through a higher than accurate gamma. It seems that any factory calibration work done here was not designed to be used with local dimming enabled. We also get quite extreme oversaturation due to the very wide color gamut and lack of sRGB clamping by default, so when viewing SDR content like YouTube videos, you might notice that skin tones look much redder than normal, almost sunburned. This isn't the worst example of factory calibration I've seen, but the default experience without adjusting any settings is definitely not as good as most other monitors. More tuning was required if Acer wanted to deliver an accurate experience with local dimming enabled. However, this display does come with an sRGB mode and you can turn off local dimming in the settings. This makes a big difference to accuracy. Now grayscale performance is looking much more like it should, with a Delta E ITP average of just 5.32 and more accurate gamma. Even the color temperature is improved to a more reasonable position. Color space emulation is also very effective at reducing oversaturation, making skin tones look more natural and reducing Delta E's below 5.0. When we compare sRGB mode performance to other monitors, this Acer model is able to produce more of a mid-table result in grayscale and slightly above average results for color checker. I think the level of factory calibration in this configuration is decent and definitely usable, especially relative to less well calibrated products like the Odyssey Neo G7. There aren't a ton of color controls in the settings menu, but a full calibration using CalMan is able to improve performance further and is a good option for people that want to harness the very wide color gamut on offer here. I would recommend leaving local dimming disabled for any SDR work, as the dynamic dimming capabilities can affect accuracy. Maximum brightness in the SDR mode is very good, topping out at 660 nits, which is still a limited number relative to what it can do in the HDR mode. This is more than enough brightness for most usage environments. However, minimum brightness is on the high side at 109 nits, so if you needed a lower level of brightness for comfortable usage in dark conditions, this might not be the monitor for you. Native contrast from this panel, so when local dimming is disabled, ends up pretty typical for an IPS LCD at around 1064:1. So when local dimming cannot dim tight enough or you disable it for SDR usage, black levels and contrast are very similar to other IPS monitors. Naturally, this means a contrast level worse than a VA LCD or OLED. Viewing angles from this monitor are good, although the effects of local dimming are more visible when viewed at off angles, so blooming and stuff are more likely to be seen when not viewed from directly in front. Uniformity also only average, with a slight vignette effect around the edges of the monitor. Monitors with a fixed backlight tend to be more uniform from edge to edge, though it does depend on the panel. When it comes to HDR performance, the XV275K P3 is well equipped with a 576 zone full array local dimming backlight. This is a significant upgrade over edge-lit dimming, as the zones are much smaller and more effective. I've shown in previous videos how crappy edge-lit panels are, but basically, if there's a bright object in the center of the display, an edge-lit panel will illuminate an entire section of the display from top to bottom just to show that central object at the correct brightness. With 576 full array zones, the panel can more tightly dim around the object in the center, and you won't see elevated brightness extending all the way to the edges of the screen. This results in a far superior HDR experience that really can deliver the high contrast ratio that's required. Bright and dark objects can be reasonably close together, with the bright object shining at over 1000 nits of brightness, while the nearby dark area is rich in shadow detail and blacks. An IPS LCD with just 576 zones doesn't have the same level of control as an OLED with per pixel local dimming, but 576 zones is sufficient for a lot of HDR scenes and ends up delivering a good entry to mid-level HDR experience. The main limitations are when bright and dark areas need to be relatively close together. The dimming system here can't always get tight enough, as each zone deals with roughly 15,000 pixels. And inside a given zone, LCDs fall back to their native contrast, which in this case is the contrast of an IPS LCD, a little over 1000:1. Relative to a VA LCD with the same zone count, this leads to a bit more blooming around bright objects and a bit more zone bleed. This is more noticeable in some scenes than others, but content like star fields, Christmas lights, and subtitles can all lead to blooming artifacts that you wouldn't see on either a higher zone count LCD, an LCD with a higher native contrast ratio, or an OLED. Nevertheless, this type of panel can still enhance both brightness and contrast over a typical SDR experience, and you will much more often get a higher than SDR contrast compared to an edge-lit panel. It's a good experience in most games and a fantastic entry point to HDR if you haven't owned an HDR display before. While all of these panel characteristics are impressive, Acer lets the experience down with firmware side annoyances. The biggest issue is that this monitor will not automatically switch between an HDR and SDR configuration, even if you set HDR in the OSD to auto. This is because auto HDR is effectively just HDR on, which hurts the SDR experience, and so you can't just leave it on auto in that mode. It also switches from the user profile to HDR profile when the setting is on auto, locking many of the features in the OSD. For the best SDR experience, this setting needs to be off. This then means that whenever you turn on HDR in a game or in Windows, you'll need to manually enable HDR in the OSD by setting the HDR setting to auto. If you don't do this, the monitor is very washed out and looks like crap. Anytime you switch between HDR and SDR, these settings need to be adjusted in an OSD that is slow and clunky to navigate due to the lack of directional toggle, although this would be frustrating on any display, no matter the quality of the OSD. To make matters worse, the local dimming setting, called adaptive dimming, is also decoupled from the HDR and SDR modes. If you want to disable dimming for the most accurate SDR experience with the least blooming, but then enable dimming for HDR gaming, you have to manually change that setting as you switch between SDR and HDR2. So now, for the best HDR configuration, you need to change 2 settings every single time you enable HDR. This is very annoying, and to make matters worse, the super sharpness setting is a bit buggy and may enable when it shouldn't in the HDR mode, meaning there's actually a third option you need to check when enabling HDR. What a mess. Configuring the monitor to work in this way shows a lack of understanding about HDR and what constitutes a good experience. It's essential that the HDR mode is automatically enabled when an HDR signal is detected, and this mode should be separate from the SDR mode with its own set of user adjustable settings that are saved to this specific mode. Switching back to the SDR mode should be graceful, painless, and preserve the user's SDR configuration. This Acer monitor does none of that. As for HDR accuracy, while you can adjust the responsiveness of the local dimming backlight, brightness and EOTF tracking are basically identical between the configurations, so I'd recommend leaving it on fast for the best gaming performance. This monitor isn't too bad at following the EOTF curve. It's a little too dark in the lower parts of the range and a bit too bright at the top end, but still it's usable for gaming. However, the monitor is strongly tinted towards blue in many parts of the brightness range with a wildly incorrect CCT average. Dark tracking, as I mentioned, is a little too dark, but for HDR this is preferable to raised blacks. Color accuracy is not too bad though, not perfect and largely impacted by its poor color temperature, but there's no weirdness in other aspects to color performance. The very wide color gamut is useful for HDR if you can find content that really pushes the Rec 2020 color space. For HDR brightness, the XV275K P3 is very bright, delivering around 1000 nits in a full screen sustained white test. This is so bright you won't want to view it in this condition for very long. Smaller window brightness gets even higher, pushing up to 1430 nits at a 10% window, around the same range as other leading LCD monitors. This is twice the brightness of a typical OLED. Then at a 2% window, we're getting 780 nits, a mid-table result that's not quite as good as the best OLEDs or LCDs, but still very sufficient for HDR. There's little difference between sustained and peak brightness for this Acer monitor until we get to the very largest window sizes, where peak brightness can actually reach at least 1400 nits. Brightness is super impressive here, with a 50% window reaching a whopping 1800 nits, though this won't be utilized very often in real-world content. Speaking of real-world content, in our video scenes, I saw real-world brightness hit 724 nits in scene 1 and 680 nits in scene 2, which is a little on the low side, but not unexpected given peak brightness for small window sizes, and that the dimming algorithm is controlling things to reduce blooming. I did see as much as 1700 nits in a real-world game, that being Cyberpunk 2077 looking at the sun, so brightness definitely can get high outside of synthetic tests. As for contrast, this monitor has a best case single frame contrast of 140,000 to 1 when dark and bright areas are far apart, a strong showing indicative of true HDR. However, when objects get closer together, the XV275K P3 isn't the best monitor, topping out at 2,887 to 1. This is notably higher than its native contrast ratio and higher than the competing Cooler Master GP27U, but we're getting less than a 3 times advantage over the native contrast, and the resulting output is lower than VA monitors. This is why I think the overall performance for HDR is more in the entry to mid-range tier. Checkerboard contrast is also just 2,304 to 1, higher than its native contrast ratio, but not as strong as the best HDR LCDs that I've tested, and limited by its dimming zone count and use of IPS tech. Also worth noting is that, like a lot of mini LED HDR monitors, input latency is notably higher in the HDR mode as the scaler needs to process the image to determine which backlight zones to activate. On the XV275K, this increases the processing delay to 10 milliseconds, which isn't unusual for an LCD, but naturally much slower than most OLEDs. Final section of this review is the Hub Essentials checklist. Acer receives an immediate deduction for their slow OSD and lack of directional toggle, and I've also given a borderline result for bezel size given some of the weirdly inaccurate product pictures on their website. Acer does a reasonable job of advertising some specifications, but listing a 200,000 to 1 native contrast ratio is pretty odd. This is specifically listed as native contrast in comparison to their dynamic contrast rating. However, they must be using a different definition to me when they are referring to native contrast. I'd say this means the panel's contrast without any enhancement features like local dimming or dynamic contrast modes, in which case that listing is wrong. This LCD does not have a 200,000 to 1 native contrast. There were several issues with motion performance, like advertising 1 millisecond response times that aren't practically achievable, especially given the locked overdrive controls in the VRR mode. Backlight strobing is also not supported at all. However, it was good to see a single overdrive mode experience. HDR is also generally advertised properly given the capabilities of this panel, and it was good to see no flickering while gaming or running our stress tests, an issue we have seen on other 4K mini LED gaming monitors. With that said, I spotted some firmware bugs as I've mentioned previously, and I'm not sure if this display supports firmware updates to resolve this. Overall, the Acer Nitro XV275K P3 is a bit of a mixed bag. It's hard to deny some of the hardware capabilities of this monitor. The 576 zone mini LED backlight, true HDR hardware, decent response time performance, but this is let down by some firmware annoyances that really hurt day-to-day usability. Whether or not you should purchase this display will ultimately come down to whether you are willing to put up with these issues or not. From a performance standpoint, there's actually quite a lot to like here. Fast response time performance for an LCD that competes well with other 4K gaming monitors and offers a decent refresh rate and single overdrive mode experience. This is despite Acer locking overdrive controls in the adaptive sync mode, one of several unnecessary firmware annoyances. It's also pleasing to see no backlight flickering even in tricky conditions, an issue that plagued the similar Cooler Master GP27U. HDR performance is typically decent as well, with the 576 zone backlight in combination with IPS technology delivering an entry to mid-level HDR experience. Brightness is very high, exceeding 1500 nits, and the dimming capabilities are able to deliver a good level of contrast with not too much blooming. The trickiest types of HDR content can throw up some issues and expose the limitations of the hardware, but for gamers wanting their first taste of a true HDR experience, I think what is being delivered here is definitely good enough to warrant paying a premium over a regular SDR monitor. In some games, particularly those that harness high levels of brightness, what this display can produce is spectacular. I was also happy with SDR factory calibration after putting the monitor into its sRGB mode, and there's other strong areas to color performance like its very wide color gamut and very high SDR brightness capabilities. However, local dimming does hurt SDR accuracy, so for the best performance it needs to be disabled, and factory calibration with dimming enabled is unimpressive. The panel's native contrast ratio is also only average given it's an IPS LCD. Receiving a decent level of performance in many key categories is nice and all, but Acer haven't been able to stick the landing due to several firmware and software issues. Switching between the HDR and SDR modes requires several setting adjustments every single time, which is annoying enough on its own, but is exacerbated by Acer's horribly slow and difficult to navigate OSD. Needing to constantly switch the same settings on and off as you perform a pretty basic thing like changing between HDR and SDR is very frustrating, and I only used this monitor for a week and a half. It really hurt the overall experience for me because I'm used to this being relatively painless on other products. At $550 US at some retailers right now, down from its $800 MSRP, the XV275K P3 is in an interesting position. If everything worked nicely, that would be a great price, just $120 more than the Gigabyte M27U for a proper HDR backlight and true HDR experience. It's also the cheapest proper 4K HDR monitor I've tested, a value proposition that's hard to ignore and blows away some of its competition. I mean, there are basic 4K SDR monitors that are much more expensive than this. But I also don't want to recommend a product that might be annoying to use on a daily basis. There's clearly been some corners cut to reach this price point, testing the firmware one of them, the basic build quality another area. I think it'll come down to how desperately you want a true 4K HDR monitor at a low price tag. Given we now know this sort of hardware can be priced below $600 US, I'd probably wait for another manufacturer to release something a bit more polished and usable. Anyway, that's it for this review. If you do appreciate the content that we make here at Hardware Unboxed, then please do consider supporting us directly via our Patreon or Floatplane accounts. Links are in the description below. You'll be enabling our independent coverage of products like this. And also, if you are interested in some of the monitors that we've been talking about throughout this review, we do have links to check their current pricing in the description. So check those things out. Anyway, that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you in the next one.